Oh, all right. So the topic today, we're just moving along in Matthew's gospel, is divorce. Some Pharisees asked Jesus a question about divorce and remarriage, and so we're going to see Jesus' answer, and the disciples have a question in response to that. If things are that way, isn't it better just not to get married? So we'll also talk about that question. So tonight's going to be a pretty interesting night, I think. I asked Katie, are you coming to Bible study tonight? One thing I know for sure is that Christ isn't encouraging people who are currently married to become single. I don't think that's what's happening when we get to the latter part of the passage. But we'll consider all that when we get there. We get to begin a new discourse today. So in the previous discourse, remember Jesus started talking about, this was chapter 18, and Jesus started talking about rank in the kingdom, what it meant to be adopted children of God rather than strangers, what it meant to be exempt from the law, and what it meant to build relationships upon unconditional and unlimited forgiveness. And that idea of forgiveness actually plays a huge role when we start talking about human relationships. And I know that this the passage that we're about to read is primarily about divorce and how married couples relate to one another. But it applies outside of that as well, I think, to every relationship that we have. I keep looking over here because I'm used to people being over here. But hey, babe, over there. So if somebody would please read Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12, and we'll get through as many of these verses as we can tonight. All right. Verses 3 through 9, the Pharisees' question. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" The Pharisees in Galilee asked questions like this. And now Jesus comes to Judea, and the Pharisees here are asking questions like this too. It's like this is what the Pharisees are trained to do. What makes this question so significant, do you think, in first century Judaism? Why would this be a question on the Pharisees' minds? Why would they ask Jesus? The text doesn't tell us that the Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus. And you pointed out that you didn't remember anything about the law saying that Moses permitted, divorce because of the hardness of people's hearts. Like the law doesn't say, because your hearts are hard, you can file a certificate of divorce. It's nowhere in the law. The law is really vague when it comes to divorce. And in, say, Deuteronomy chapter 24, you have this statement that says, if you file a certificate of divorce, if you divorce, which means it assumes that divorce is going to happen. And then in Malachi, you have a statement like, God hates divorce. All of a sudden, there's this tension, right, in the text and the law. And the Pharisees' goal is to, keep the whole degree of the law? In order to keep the whole degree of the law, you have to know what the law says about every single little thing. And where the law doesn't say something about that, you have to try and fill in the gaps. This is one of those gaps.
This becomes man-made laws.
Yeah. So the Pharisees are asking this question, which is natural, right? When we see something in Scripture, it's really kind of vague, we ask about it too. It's natural for the human brain to do this. I think it's a good thing that we try to figure stuff out. It's not good when we make it an idol, right? The Pharisees sort of made it an idol, and that's no secret, because they've been doing it throughout Matthew's gospel. Have you ever heard of Euthyphro's dilemma?
Who?
Euthyphro's dilemma. It's a work by Plato, and Plato was a student of Socrates. Mm-hmm. Socrates never wrote anything. We don't have anything that Socrates wrote. Plato wrote everything we know about Socrates. And Plato used Socrates, his mentor, as a character in his writings. And so Socrates meets a man named Euthyphro, who worships the gods, right? And the gods, he says, Euthyphro makes a statement, the gods are good. And Socrates responds. Socrates always asking questions. You've heard of the Socratic method of learning, right? It's asking questions in order to get people to think and elicit a response. That's basically the Socratic method. So Socrates asks the question, are the gods good, referring to morally good, are the gods good because they keep the law, or is the law good because it is given by the gods?
Is he talking about gods plural?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. When Plato writes it, he's talking about gods plural. And Christians have taken this in Christian universities. You can hear this question being asked in philosophy classrooms. Is God good because he keeps the law, or is the law good because it was given by God? What makes that question such an interesting question? Yeah. Now, if you answer the question by saying, well, God is good because he keeps the law, then you're subjecting God to something outside of God, the law. But if you say the law is good because God gave the law, that means there is no absolute standard for what is good. It's arbitrary, which presents quite the dilemma in the Christian worldview, right? Now, somebody who knows the Bible will say, well, the law is founded upon God's character. So it's God who is good because of his own nature and his own character, and the law flows from that, right? Which is neither of those options. But because the question is asked in this way, you don't even know that that's one of the optional answers, right? And so you go one way, and there are logical problems with answering that way. And if you give the other answer, there are logical problems there. This question that the Pharisees are asking, it's that kind of question. It's that kind of question. If Jesus answers and says, it is unlawful for someone to get divorced, the response is, then why does God allow it? Why does he say, if you give a certificate of divorce? See? But if you say, no, it's lawful for somebody to get a divorce, then why does God say he hates divorce? You see what kind of question this is? Like, that's the kind of question they're asking Jesus. This is the kind of question that they would debate in their ecclesia, in their synagogues, right? This is it. This is the kind of question I personally love. You guys don't know that about me, do you? All right. Verse 4. And Jesus answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. How does Jesus answer this question? Yeah. He doesn't go back to Malachi, and he doesn't go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24. He goes back to Genesis chapter 2, when God created the marriage relationship. And he says, God created man for woman, woman for man. God put the two together. God makes them one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. There, Jesus takes the position, divorce is unlawful for any reason. The Pharisees say, is divorce lawful for any reason? Jesus said, yeah, based on Genesis 2. Divorce is unlawful for any reason. So he takes one of those positions that should be problematic. It should present, logical problems, or at least present some sort of problem where you're in danger of being incoherent with the law. Because Moses in Deuteronomy 24 said, if someone files a certificate of divorce, then, and he spells out the law there. Is Jesus' response problematic? No, divorce is not lawful for any reason. But then Moses is going to say, if you get a certificate of divorce, is that problematic? I mean, obviously the answer is no. It's Jesus speaking, but I want us to think about it anyway, right? How might it be problematic? Of course, you're thinking the Pharisees have heard this kind of answer before. They debate this in the synagogue. The Sanhedrin probably sits around. This is this is the fun question that they think about, right? To occupy time when they're not deciding on a civil case or something. And it's like, hey, what do you think about the divorce problem? We talk about, what do you think about the problem of evil? They're like, what do you think about the problem of divorce? So they're not unfamiliar with an answer like this. Yeah, I think it's unlawful for any reason. And then the response would always be, why would Moses then command it in the law? And that's how they answered Jesus, isn't it? Verse 7, they said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? This is just part of the routine at this point, right? That's just the next, okay, yeah. Well, why would Moses?
Catch-22, so no matter what he said, they would have a comeback. They'd have
right.
a snappy comeback.
And if Jesus said, well, sure, it's lawful, said, well, then why would God hate divorce? That would be the other reply. So this is a debate that they would have all the time. Did Moses actually command divorce there in Deuteronomy chapter 24?
Just divorce.
No, it doesn't. All it does is assume that divorce is something that people do. It doesn't command anything, right? In fact, we look here at Deuteronomy chapter 24, and I'll just point out some things in these first 4 verses. So when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. The word for indecency there is a word that comes across as promiscuity, unfaithfulness, infidelity, right? So indecency in English doesn't quite cover it, but it's promiscuity. It is infidelity in her. And he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. So there's another stipulation to this law, right? So he has divorced her, she has gone, and she became another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and also writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her to be his wife, her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again as his wife. They're restricting remarriage after divorce, particularly remarriage to the unfaithful partner, right? The partner who has been promiscuous or has been seen to show infidelity, right, in marriage. It says, that divorce it's a permanent separation, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination. How has the unfaithful partner been defiled? It wasn't because like people assume that this defilement is because she had relations with somebody else. No, the defilement here is unfaithfulness and the promiscuity itself, right? She has been defiled. She's unclean. She is not a faithful partner. She has been shown not to be a faithful partner. For that is an abomination before the Lord. What's the abomination here? Unfaithfulness, particularly infidelity, promiscuity. And you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So there we see the context, Deuteronomy chapter 24. And when the Pharisees reply and say, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? It's not quite what was going on in the law. The Pharisees, they've added something to the text. They've added something to the law. And then Jesus replies, he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wife. Moses didn't. It's not against the law because God knows that you are hard of heart. But from the beginning, it has not been this way. That's not the way God designed it to be. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. And I say to you, here Jesus teaching what Deuteronomy 24 teaches, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, that promiscuity, infidelity, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Now, according to Jesus then, all divorce is unlawful. It is against God's law. But when divorce happens, it means there's grace, right? And he also includes here like remarriage, particularly in context to like an unfaithful partner, right? In this case, remarriage is considered adultery on top of like the divorce being unlawful. And there's another sin added on, which is adultery, right? They're not one and the same thing. So some people will read this passage in Matthew chapter 19 and go, oh, well, God is perfectly fine with divorce on the basis of infidelity. And that's not what Matthew 19 is getting at. Jesus says, no, it's unlawful for any reason. And if you are unfaithful, if you are the unfaithful partner, or you're going through marriages like this, then you also commit adultery on top of that divorce. So it's two sins instead of one. And that's what Jesus is getting at here in his response to the Pharisees. What do you think it means? And Jesus says, because of the hardness of your hearts. What do you think it means for someone to be hard of heart? The whole reason marriages don't work out is, it seems like this would be a pretty important thing for people to understand before getting themselves into marriage. Like, if you're hard of heart, your marriage is going to be painful, right? But if we're just using the opposite of hard, if you're soft of heart, you have a soft heart, then your marriage is going to be blissful and happy and blessed, right? So that's the dichotomy. What's the difference? What makes a person hard of heart and not ready for marriage, and what makes a person soft of heart and ready for marriage? So back to Deuteronomy 24. It's amazing that the answer to this question is also in those 4 verses. I'll read it again for us. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts in her hand and sends her out from his house, she leaves his house and becomes another man's wife. Notice, because this isn't a command, that divorce isn't required on the basis of infidelity. Sometimes people will read texts like this and they'll say, oh, if my partner's being unfaithful, then I have the right and I should divorce them and send them away. Notice that's not a requirement in this text, because this isn't a command. This is an if. In the event that he sends her away with a certificate of divorce, these are the laws to follow. It doesn't mean that the other partner has to do that. The other partner could choose to forgive, right? So that's the other option. They could choose to forgive, and then they don't even have to worry about the rest of this stuff. But notice this, what leads to the one partner giving a certificate of divorce and sending her away is that she, his wife, finds no favor in his eyes. This is where I think the hardness of heart comes in. What does it mean that she doesn't find favor in his eyes? What is he concerned about if he looks disfavorably upon his bride? Yeah. The hardness of heart has something to do with desire here, right? If a man finds no favor in his wife, or she doesn't find favor in his eyes, right? That has something to do with the man's desire. She's not fulfilling her household role, but that doesn't mean he has to fail to practice grace and forgiveness, right? It doesn't mean he has to fail too. He could become the living sacrifice, be the living sacrifice, like Christ did for his church. Okay, now we're seeing some of the symbolism here and why this is so important, because the marriage relationship, it's a picture of Christ and his church. And so the man representing Christ should be the atonement for his bride, should be the redeemer of his bride, should be forgiving his bride unconditionally. See how the previous conversation, unconditionally, and in a way that is unlimited, infinite, an infinite number of times. He should be doing that, right? And that's the man's job, to love his bride like Christ loves the church, if we want to go to the book of Ephesians. That's the man's responsibility, to die for his wife no matter her insufficiencies, no matter her sins against him. Like, that's what the man should be doing. that is lawful. That's why it's unlawful for a man to give his wife a certificate of divorce for any reason, according to Jesus in Matthew chapter 19. This hardness of heart has something to do with a man's desire, the fact that he's choosing not to look favorably upon his wife here in Deuteronomy 24. Why would the hardness of heart have something to do with our desire? Of course, God said, you can have any tree in the garden except this one. Now, God did that on purpose. He knew they were going to take from this tree. It's nature, hardness of heart. Don't eat from this tree. When you eat from this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. The serpent comes to Eve, and he tempts Eve. How does he tempt Eve? What does he say to get Eve to eat of the fruit?
He built it up. It's a beautiful fruit.
Beautiful. Look at how beautiful this is. Look at how lovely this is. Look at how tasty this is. And don't you know that this is profitable to make you wise? This will give you knowledge. God doesn't want you to eat from this tree because then he knows you will be like him. Don't you want to be like him? He appeals to what? Desire. Vanity. Yeah, desire. Human nature, human desire. The desire of a hard heart is self-will, self-interest, self-righteousness, self-identity, self. So Eve ate of the tree because that's how she could be like God. And she gave some to her husband who was with her. And he ate from the same tree. Why? Because he wanted to be like God. It was all about desire. And then you get to Jeremiah chapter 17. And Jeremiah, what does Jeremiah reveal about the human heart? It's wicked, deceitful above all else, and incurable. That's what it means to have a hard heart. And then you look at prophets like the prophet Ezekiel, and this is in Ezekiel like 32, somewhere around there. And the prophet Ezekiel writes concerning the nation of Israel that God will bring his people who have been scattered among the nations. He will bring them back to the promised land. He will gather his people who have been dispersed among the nations. And he will rid them of their idolatry. He'll get rid of their idols. He'll cause them to worship him instead of their idols. And Ezekiel, when he's describing this, he says, God is going to remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And explicitly that meant turning his people from idol worship, the worship of their desires, to worship him. And then we have an explicit reference in the prophets, something that the Pharisees would have been aware of, and of course Jesus was aware of it. He inspired them. He's the one who spoke to and through the prophets. That God causes people to have softened hearts, that he actually replaces their hard heart with a heart of flesh, their heart of stone with a heart of flesh, by turning people from idol worship to proper worship before God the Father, to the glory of God. Of course, the exaltation of Jesus Christ. And that is how, so the hardness of heart, the pursuit of self-will, self-desire, self-interest, self-satisfaction, self-pleasure, self-identity, all of that's wrapped up in the hardness of the heart. And the way God deals with that, the way our hearts are softened, is, of course, if that's all we know, and we're like, what hope is there for any marriage? Well, why do people in the world get married today? Because somebody makes me happy, right? This person makes me happy. Of course I want to marry them. It may not always be that way, right? This person makes me happy. Of course I want to marry them. Oh, this person is eye candy. Of course I want to marry that person. She is hot, right? Of course I want to marry that person. We got pregnant, so we need to get married. right? Because it's culturally expected. There are still countries and there are still places in the United States and families that people grow in where it's expected that someone would get married, right? So I need to get married because it's culturally expected of me. All of these reasons that people get married sounds a lot like self-interest and self-will and self-identity, because this is how I can seek my own pleasure in an acceptable way. It all seems like self-interest and self-will, self-identity, self-pleasure, self-everything. No wonder so many marriages end the way that they do, with the handing of a certificate of divorce, because we've built marriage on the hardness of our hearts. And how does God soften hearts? What does he do when he takes out the heart of stone and replaces it with the heart of flesh? He takes us from worshiping our idols. We call this regeneration, second birth. He gives us a new heart. It turns our attention away from our self-will, our self-interest, our self-desires. It turns our attention away from that and toward him, toward his will, toward his interests, toward his design, toward his identity, toward his pleasure, toward his everything. And in our entire lives, we become consumed about worshiping God and who he is for his glory. And as we worship God, we just naturally become more concerned about giving of ourselves rather than taking for ourselves, and giving and giving and giving. And this shift, this is the biblical prerequisite for a blessed and happy, joyful marriage. And that's the difference, right? Does that make sense? Did I explain that well? 10 through 12. The disciples said to him, "If the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry." All right. So the disciples make this statement. If the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it's better not to marry. And they're talking with Jesus. Jesus affirms this in verse 11. He says, "Not all can accept this statement, but only those to whom it is given." And he says in verse 12, "He who is able to accept this, let him accept it." What are the disciples getting at? And what does Jesus affirm when the disciples say, if the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry? Is it just better for all people to remain single forever? That doesn't seem likely. God designed marriage, right? So if that's not what's going on in verse 10, what is? Are the disciples here talking about marriage in general? Not likely, because God designed marriage and he designed it to be pure and holy and good and satisfying and productive, right? If the relationship with a man to his wife is like this, now the phrase "like this" indicates that they're referring to something that was said prior to this, right? In academia, they teach us, don't make people fish for what you're talking about. Don't use words like this so people have to go and read before that line. Just say what you mean. Every time you write this, just put it in there so people know what you're talking about. So when we see the word "this," what we have to do is look at the previous part of the passage. Matthew didn't write like academics do today. And that's perfectly fine. We just have to go to a previous part of the passage to figure out what this means. If the marriage of a man to his wife is like this, like what? That's it. Heart of heart. If the heart of stone hasn't been replaced with the heart of flesh, isn't it better not to marry? Now this question starts to make a little more sense in light of the whole Bible, right? God designed marriage for people with regenerate hearts. for people who would live for the good of the partner and not for their own will, for their own pleasure, for their own desire. There's a reason the Apostle Paul writes, do not be unequally yoked, married to an unbeliever. Believers don't get married to an unbeliever. That's just going to be trouble for you. There's a reason Paul writes stuff like that, right? There is a reason, and I'll see if I can remember all the terms that I got to look up today. Are you ready for this? I'm gonna test my brain. Of course, I've been working my brain overtime because my paper is due on Friday, and it's like 67 pages right now. And so I'm editing, formatting, getting my bibliography. Y'all remember doing bibliographies? Y'all remember ever doing bibliography? Didn't you love those?
No.
I actually have grown to kind of like it because I'm like, oh yeah, and it helps me remember like the book names and the authors and who said stuff. So I didn't like it when I was in college. It was almost new to me in college. I think I did like an annotated bibliography or something in high school, but in college I was like, oh, this is the worst part of writing a paper. Now I'm okay with it. Maybe it's just because it's familiar. So there's a reason, of course, the church doesn't recognize homosexual marriages. Because homosexual marriages are, we're not just arbitrarily going, homosexuality is evil and bad and wrong and ugly and sinful and you're going to die and go to hell. Like, no, that's not what it is. There's a very real reason that we don't recognize homosexual marriages, homosexual relationships in that way. Because the marriage is built on self-will, self-desire, self-pleasure, self-preference, right? It's everything that is opposed to godly marriage. It's not just, oh, it's wrong for a man to marry a man because the parts don't fit. Like that's not at all what the Bible gets at, right? No, it's because that marriage is built on my own preferences and not God's preferences. It doesn't go back to Genesis 2. That's just as bad as filing a certificate of divorce, right? There's a reason, in the same way, the church doesn't recognize transgender, the true church, I should say, doesn't recognize transgender relationships or marriages. Self-will, self-desire, self-preference. I want to be sure to communicate this like in a loving way, because people need forgiveness and they need to understand why the church doesn't recognize these sorts of marriages or relationships, right? But for the same reason the church wouldn't recognize like a zoophobic relationship, which is a love of animals, right? And there are people arguing for, okay, the same reason the church can't recognize pedophilic relationships, pedophilic marriages, same reason the church wouldn't recognize that. The same reason the church wouldn't recognize a technophobic relationship, which is marriage to a robot. Yeah, these are actual words, actual things like people have thought about. Like it's the same reason the church wouldn't be able to support any of those things, because any of that would be based on the personal preferences and pleasure selfishly of the individual, of the person. It would be just as much a sin for me to have married Katie just because she made me happy or just because I thought she was hot, right? That's just as bad as homosexual marriage and transgender marriage or zoophobic marriage or pedophilic marriage. It's all the same. The prerequisite for godly marriage is a softening of our hearts and us caring about, through marriage, representing Christ and His church, serving others, for the marriage to be a picture of the gospel. If the marriage isn't a picture of the gospel, it's no marriage at all. And we begin to understand, like, oh, this is the Christian definition of marriage then. I used to think this, that God saw two people as marriage as when they did the deed, that's becoming one flesh and God recognizes that as marriage, right? I used to think that way. I think a lot of people think that way because the church hasn't taken the time to define marriage in a Christian way. When you read through Scripture, it's not that act that causes somebody to be married. It's the fact that they covenant with each other. I am going to devote myself to you and only you for the rest of my life, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, because this marriage isn't about my preferences. This marriage isn't about me getting what I want. This marriage is about the man representing Christ and the woman representing the church and painting that picture of the gospel. That's what marriage is. So we covenant together, be a picture of the gospel, and we covenant in front of a local church family. This is why weddings got started. This is how the tradition got started, because the church would come together and affirm this covenant marriage and affirm to support it in any way they can and recognize that as a picture of the gospel. Marriage is, from the beginning of time, a religious institution. And especially considering the Constitution of the United States, the state has no business defining marriage or redefining marriage or having any sort of control over marriages or having justices do marriages at all, because marriage is a religious institution. Marriage belongs to God. Marriage is a covenant put together in the context of the local church, and that's what marriage is. We have defined marriage like that in our own church constitution, right? Now, our own church constitution, we clarify marriage is not just two people living together, and marriage is not just based on the act that people, perform in marriage. Marriage is a covenant, and marriage is to be affirmed as a covenant relationship by the local church. And when marriage is severed, it is severed. You do that divorce thing. That's a definite splitting up, and that is in itself is a picture of when people aren't married to Christ, they are cut off from Him. Everything about marriage and everything in the law about divorce, it's a picture of Christ and the work Christ is doing. And it belongs to God. That illustration belongs to God. That relationship belongs to God. And so the disciples here, they say, if people aren't regenerate, isn't it better not to get married? And the answer to that is yes. It is better for unregenerate people not to get married. It's better for people who have hard hearts not to get a spouse and put their spouse through whatever damage they're going to do to their spouse, right? It's better for them to remain single. And in the event of divorce, then, which is particularly in view here, right? Then this kind of marriage they're particularly talking about is a remarriage. Like if somebody gets divorced, isn't it better if they don't remarry? And that's the advice Paul gives in his epistle, right? I would rather you be like me, not even getting remarried. And that's where the disciples go with this. And Jesus affirms this in verses 11 and 12. But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. Someone who is in the flesh and not regenerate will hear what I'm teaching or will read it on the blog, and they'll say, they won't accept it. The state, or the world, I should say, wants the benefits of marriage. Wants everything that we have in Christ and in a godly marriage and in a covenanted marriage. They desire that. They long for that. And so they mimic Christian marriage. They mimic it with sex, and they mimic it by having a ceremony, and they mimic it by calling people husband and wife, or wife and wife, or husband and husband, right? And the world does that based all on people's preferences. And that's not even recognized as marriage before God, because it's not based in Christ, and it's not built on the regenerate heart, the softened heart that is the prerequisite for real, true, blessed, happy, joyful marriage. Not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it is given. Only those who have a regenerate heart can accept a teaching like this. Those without a regenerate heart, this is foreign to them. In verse 12, for there are eunuchs, of course, that means the goods are cut off, right? Some men were born eunuchs. They don't have the ability to pleasure themselves. So this ultimately goes back to self-pleasure, right? Self-fulfillment, self-identity, self-preference. For there are eunuchs who are born that way. There are people who are born without the ability to seek pleasure from a partner. So marriage doesn't really matter to them, right? From their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. People who are forced not to be able to seek pleasure or their own preferences. And this applies like on a physical level, yes, on a literal physical level, yes, but then the truth applies beyond that, right? And there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, decided freely to remain celibate for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, to remain single for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And he who is able to accept this, let him accept it. There are some people who are called to singleness, whether they chose it or not. There are some people who are called to that based on the will of God. And for those who get married, a marriage is to glorify God and exalt Jesus Christ. And Jesus here says, he who is able to accept this, those with a regenerate heart, accept this. And this accept this it's now referring to two things, right? The first is the definition of biblical covenantal marriage within the body of Christ. And the second is there are people who are called to singleness. People in the church, and everyone in the church is challenged to deny self-preference, right? To deny self, take up their crosses and follow Jesus. So someone in the church who's a woman who's attracted to women, biblical singleness is the call on their life, unless God gives that person, feelings for a man. And if a man is attracted to men, the biblical call on his life is it's celibacy, it's singleness, because he is here to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow Jesus. And unless Jesus, changes his heart's desire and puts him in a monogamous heterosexual relationship according to God's design, because it's a picture of Christ and his church, then he is to remain celibate. So that's the teaching here. And Christ calls us to marriage that is about him, not about us. And that's what real marriage is. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. That sort of marriage is way more satisfying, way more enduring, way more worthwhile than anything the world tries to use to mimic that sort of marriage. And if biblical singleness is the call on someone's life, because then we just get to be married to Christ, right? That in itself, way more satisfying, enduring, and joyful than any way the world tries to mimic godly marriage with dating, which is so idolatrous, with dating, or with the weird way that it tries to redefine marriage, which belongs to biblical faith, belongs to the church, or tries to set people up in meaningful relationships, and meaningful relationships just means you make me happy, which now that we have seen what biblical marriage is, that just seems really shallow, doesn't it? That's the secret. And Jesus says as much. If you seek to save your life, you will lose it. If you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. And that's the secret to life. You're welcome. All right. That's all I got for us tonight. Y'all have anything else?